Okay. I suspect you can hear.
I can hear because I got, yes, you can turn it up. I can turn it up, it's pretty good.
But I bet you can also turn it down so you don't hear anybody.
I have a
Well, it depends on who you're sitting with, right?
good friend who did that all the time.
As long as it's not your spouse, you're okay.
Well, he doesn't need one, he just doesn't.
He just doesn't hear you anyway. So Dan, are you still off or are you teaching now? Back to the classroom? Did you miss it? Are you teaching undergraduates or? Okay, that's a little more challenging, yeah. Yeah, from what I hear, the motivation levels with undergraduates is variable at best. Seriously, yeah? Mm-hmm. Yeah. That is really interesting. Okay. They're less competitive. You said or more. Interesting. My uncle taught at Columbia, and he used to say to me, the freshmen, it's like there's some you just want to embrace and love, and it's wonderful, and the other half, less so. Less so. Yeah, whatever. Hand doing okay? Your hand doing okay? Same. Is there anything you can do? Does heat help or does it no? Mm-hmm. So you lose more mobility. Yeah. Yes.
As a very influential man, you know,
You are.
each week I ask Melissa, where is this painting of Rabbi Moshe Kahanas? I always do a
Where'd it
l'chaim
go?
with him. It was always on that wall. They took it down to decorate, but she won't put it back up. And I even asked the Rebbetzin, can you help me with it? You know, she would like it up there too, but it doesn't get up there. It's stuck in a closet gathering dust. It should be up there. He's our Rabbi Emeritus.
Okay, I'll
You know,
see
I'm
what I
working
can
on
do.
a second Rabbi Emeritus, of course. We've got a second one cooking.
Yeah.
You know, but with your tremendous influence, we could get it
Yeah,
done.
there you go. That's people run the other way. What are you talking about? So I'm going to ask everyone to come over to this section over here, and you can sit in the back, but we really would prefer that you come forward. Think of it like the opera. You want to sit in the first few rows.
No, you don't because you have to look.
Oh, okay. I've always had this urge to put out the seats in the sanctuary, and then once everybody sits down, to take out the front row and move forward because there's nobody there anyway. Force you to be closer. You can hear better. Right, and if indeed that you have a concern with hearing, for sure you should be sitting up front. All right, Chevra. So we've had so far a full Shabbos with Dr. Bell, and at this point I'm just going to welcome him back and be delighted to listen. The The floor is yours, the walls are yours, the whole ceiling, the room. Oh, yes.
We'll wait for him to come back because I don't want him to miss anything. So he would feel bad. Or not, I'm not sure. How's everybody doing so far? We're still awake, more or less? Yeah, I mean, I might be able to help in that regard. Yeah, I don't know about you, but it doesn't matter what time Shabbat starts Friday night. The moment I make Kiddush, I'm ready for bed. It could be 4 o'clock, it could be 9 o'clock, it doesn't matter. Well, while we're waiting, I'll begin with a story. I live in Chicago, West Rogers Park, or as we call it, West Religious Park. West Religious Park. So I'll start with a story, which is the topic that we're going to talk about is tradition, which sounds like it should be a pretty straightforward topic, right? We all know what tradition is. We've sung it, we've heard it, we've watched it on film, we know all these good things. But the truth is when you start digging into tradition, it means something quite different, and it can be interpreted in many different ways. But the reason why I ended up thinking about this topic is I was invited by the Jewish Educators Assembly, the conservative movement's educational leaders group, to make a presentation when they were in New York a few years ago. And I'm going to date myself, but I always imagined, those educators we had in supplementary schools and Hebrew schools, they were all, let's just say, superannuated. They didn't really have many new ways of thinking about education. And my estimation was I was going to go into a room of very old people who've been doing exactly the same thing for many years, tradition. And I get to this hotel in New York, which is right by the New York Islanders ice skating rink. I don't know anything about New York, I'm not a New Yorker. And I walk in and it is teeming with young people in their early 20s, mid-20s, they're all over the place. And they look much more religious than I expected them also. They had like black hats, they're wearing shaitels, they got all this stuff. And I'm thinking, well, this is amazing, this is a different audience than I expected. And then I go into the conference, and in fact, it's a room full of all the people I expected. And what was happening out in the front was shidduchim. People were coming for dates. And matchmaking was going on in the hallways, and it was for the Orthodox community, and it was not at all the audience that I expected. But the people that I did end up spending time with were really remarkable. They had so much experience, so much richness of Jewish learning and knowledge, and we got into a number of really interesting conversations. About resilience was one of the topics, and then about tradition particularly. So I give that by way of preface because that's how I started in on this particular topic, which I've now written about a fair amount. But I've thought about it in many different ways over the years. So I sometimes find that we go back to tradition and it becomes very stultifying in some ways. It feels like it's fixed. There's not a lot of opportunity for us to think differently. And in my neighborhood, which is a very Orthodox neighborhood, people would say, of course, certain things you have to do, it's passed on. And what I've learned over the years is that even in those contexts, tradition is ever evolving, things are changing, we are making up rules left and right all the time. But we don't really want to admit it, or maybe we don't even realize we're doing it sometimes. So I do want to just suggest at the beginning that this comes out of a particular context and some work that I've been thinking about. But since it's this part of the day and you're still awake and you're still with me, we're going to be a little bit more participatory. So I'd love to know what it is you think tradition is after that long journey. What is tradition? So what comes to mind when you think about tradition? A way of your parents? Okay, yeah. Okay, so something that relatives, particularly close ones, might have done. What else? Things that we do repetitively. Okay, yeah, so it becomes habitual in a certain kind of way. That's the tradition part. We always did it that way, so that's the way we keep doing it. Great. Okay, yeah, so it's what a group of people do, and however we define that, sometimes it's by a group of leaders, sometimes it's by the common practice. That becomes the tradition, the way that things do it. In the period that I study in Germany, we oftentimes say that minhag is the halacha. The customs of the people actually becomes the law of the land, regardless of whether that's accepted in other places or not. So what a group of people might do, yeah?
It's something that anchors us.
Okay, so it actually doesn't even matter what it is, but it's something that grounds us, that connects us in some really interesting and important ways. Yeah. What's that? Fiddler on the Roof? Okay, yeah. I confess that I only saw that for the first time a year ago, and it did not disappoint, and there is tradition involved in this. right? But even that was a little bit bending and wavering in some ways, right, after a period of time. But it is something that we think about as old and nostalgic, and has song. And music is always good for tradition, for sure. Yes. A comfort. Okay, so you point to two things. One is tradition has what we say in my neighborhood, it's good for your kishkas, right? It's like warms you inside and it gives you something that feels connective or whatever. And we also recognize that we add to it because we're sort of actively involved with engaging with our tradition. Now, that's not true in every religious setting, but I do think it's true probably in this one in particular. Yeah. Yeah.
Some of our halakha came from what they saw people doing.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. Sometimes that's related to knowledge that we've gained, and that becomes the religious ruling, the sort of legal ruling as well. Okay, good. Anything else about tradition? We've said a lot. That's good. So we'll start with, I always like to start with definitions. I don't think, oh, I'm sorry, yes. Ah, very nice. Yeah. Right. Okay. So you raise a really important point, which is we can have traditions about a lot of different things. Sometimes it's about our culinary connection. Sometimes it's cultural. Sometimes it's religious or legal. Yeah. Yeah, music. Lots of really good traditions. My kids, I've shared with a few of you, play Eastern music. On one plays a Persian guitar, and the other one plays the oud. I don't really understand any of it myself. It all sounds out of key. But they're really great musicians, and they draw from a tradition that is really rich and deep. And I'm a heavy metal drummer, so that's all I know. I know Black Sabbath and Iron Maiden. These are the only things that I listen to. So we don't exactly get along. We come out of the same tradition, but we split off at some point. But tradition can have a lot of different kind of cultural elements as well. Yeah.
I guess it goes along with the comfort and, when you have children, it's.
I want to strangle them also.
There's comfort in, that's one thing you're comfortable with a young kid.
Mm-hmm.
Is your tradition, your holidays, what's coming up, what you're going to teach them, and it gives you a comfort there, I think, of a basis of belief that you can share.
Yeah, so you have a connection with that generation, but you also sometimes evolve those over time together with them. I remember when I was going, my son was having his bar mitzvah in COVID, and I had to go and he had to practice reading the Torah, and the rabbi said to me, "What's your tradition on whether you hold the Torah open or not?" I'm like, I don't know, do I have a tradition for that? But I did, I suppose, right? I had a common custom that I usually practiced, and that was the family's tradition, even though I didn't even know it at the time, right? So sometimes we don't even know what these things are. So I sometimes like to begin with definitions, and Encyclopedia Judaica is not exactly my model for any definitions, but this one I think actually fits the bill. It's the first text I have here. It says, generally tradition, and in Hebrew we call it Masorah, refers to beliefs, doctrines, customs, ethical and moral standards, and cultural values and attitudes, so you've named a lot of those things already, which are transmitted orally or by personal example. And I really like that part of it. Sometimes we talk about these, but sometimes it's simply the things that we do that other people notice, that other people watch, that they imbibe themselves. Under this designation, the process of transmission itself is also included. So we speak about tradition, we're talking about the actual act of carrying it over to somebody else, right? And it comes actually from the Latin root for tradition also. Theologically, in Judaism, tradition is the name applied to the unwritten code of law given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. So part of the tradition are the things that we didn't hear explicitly, but that we somehow know intuitively or because of this tradition that was passed on from generation to generation. So of course the second quote is the one that we often hear about when we think about tradition, Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers, how Moses received the tradition on Sinai and he passes it on to Joshua, to the elders, and to all these other groups. So the first very clear definition of a tradition is something that we have, that we've developed, whatever the context might be, that we are passing along, transmitting to other people, other generations, other groups, however it might be. But as you suggested earlier, there's also this element of what we might call knowledge. Right? Tradition teaches us an insight or a certain kind of knowledge that we might not otherwise have known, might not have been particularly clear on the surface. So the Talmud in the Tractate of Chulin has this lovely thing. Rabbi Yitzchak says, this is number 3, a kosher bird may be eaten on the strength of a tradition that it is kosher. That's a really powerful statement, right? If we don't know that it is specifically, but we have a tradition that it is, then it's fine, without inspecting for the signs listed in the Mishnah. And the hunter is deemed credible to say, my teacher conveyed to me that this bird is kosher. Rabbi Yochanan said, and this is the halacha only when the teacher is familiar with the non-kosher birds and with their names. So we add this further stipulation that we can rely on this knowledge, this real-world experience, provided that the person who has it and is sharing it actually has knowledge, right, and understands the difference between these things. So it has to be, let's call it kosher knowledge or truthful knowledge, but that actually has a very high standing in and of itself. That somebody can share that with us because we know they have the expertise and the experience. Now, tradition sometimes focuses in a different kind of way. I get a little annoyed about this. It's my pet peeve, but I think sometimes tradition becomes the opportunity to say no to lots of things. Oh, I'm sorry, that's just not a part of the tradition. We can't do that, right? And in fact, the rabbis describe it as a fence around the Torah and certain community beliefs. And this is my favorite, number 4, Rabbeinu Yonah. I'm a medievalist by training, so anything in the 13th century feels really good to me. Tradition is a safeguarding fence around Torah. Traditions are the full spellings and the incomplete spellings, right, the Masorah, of the words of the Torah and the cantillation notes that the sages passed on to their students. And they are a safeguarding fence around the written Torah such that you do not find differences among the books. Right, tradition in this case makes sure that things are consistent, right, and that there's a connection between them. It also makes sense in that the actual text itself becomes standardized. Right? And so the tradition helps to inform the way that we read and the way that we understand how we even spell things, right, and the connection that we have between them. So here you have a number of different elements of tradition that are all beginning to emerge, and they are at all levels of our kind of religious, social, communal engagements, and they're really sort of very powerful. Bachya ibn Pakuda, another medievalist, also has a similar kind of note in the Duties of the Heart, which is one of these, texts that we teach all the time in our sort of philosophy and theology classes. He writes, therefore, be careful that your steps not stray from the path of the forefathers and the path of the early ones towards a new path you have devised. I like this already. It's very sinister, right? I want to make sure that we follow in the footsteps of our forefathers, not creating any kind of newfangled ideas or things. And be careful to not rely on your intellect, nor to take counsel only with yourself. It's a really interesting phrase, right? Because I could rationalize a lot of things that I might want to do, but if I have a tradition that actually informs and guides and creates guardrails for me, I shouldn't get too full of myself. I don't know everything. I might be making something up that might be problematic or wrong. And by the way, don't just do it on your own. Last night we talked about iron sharpens iron, and you need 2 matches in order to get a fire going, right? When you're talking to yourself, you can justify all sorts of things. But when you're in conversation with other people, and that's part of the tradition, it's a group, it's a community, then all of a sudden it means really something quite different. Do not distrust your forefathers in the tradition they bequeath to you as to what is good for you. I personally, I think I'm a child of the 70s in this case, or the late 60s. I don't really like people to tell me what to do. That's why the rabbis usually invite me. I only get invited to places outside of Chicago. They don't have me speak in any synagogue in Chicago. It's unfortunate, but probably wise. Do not reject their advice and what they taught you, because none of the plans you can think of were not previously known, and their good and evil consequences were already weighed. Like, give up, right? They already thought of all these things. There's nothing new that you can add to this, right? We've evaluated these situations. We thought about all the issues. Sometimes I get a little bit of a kick out of this because particularly as I've been working in science lately, the rabbis had lots of things to say about science. They didn't know anything about science, as far as I can tell. But it sounded good writing in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. But I think our science has progressed a little bit. So I sometimes say, well, what is the spirit of what they're trying to do? How are they interpreting things? There's something valuable there, even if their conclusions might not be exactly correct. And I'm not the only heretic to say this. Already in the Middle Ages, we had lots of people like Azaria de Rossi and others who were critical of what the rabbinical statements in these regards. But notice, tradition here sometimes can be very constricting, right? It's against innovation. It's against thinking in different kinds of ways. There's both a benefit and a downside to that, right? The benefit is we do create community and a sense of belonging. We create shared values and shared sense of the world. The downside is it can be very sort of disruptive to innovation, to thinking differently or trying new things. Maimonides does this, I think, quite well, as Maimonides always does. He makes an important distinction here. True beliefs, this is number 6, true beliefs are those which teach, in a literal fashion, some truth about God, such as his existence, unity, eternity, and omnipotence. Their purpose is to enable one to attain intellectual perfection. So those are true beliefs, right? These are things that allow us to get at the sort of deeper meanings about something and attain an intellectual rigor. He contrasts that with necessary beliefs, the basis of which is tradition and not philosophy. So we got the true beliefs. You can already see that's an elevated kind of way for Maimonides to think. And then we have the necessary beliefs that are based on tradition, expressed in a figurative manner, right? They're not literal like the true beliefs, they're figurative. We have to tell stories and try to get people to understand through a variety of different mechanisms. And they fulfill a political function in that by instilling obedience to the Torah, they regulate the social relations of human beings. They also, by the way, let people acquire some noble qualities. So they're not all bad. They give us a guidepost, a map, on how we might be able to behave and behave better. But they're essentially to inculcate a certain way of belief and behavior and obedience, right? And that is his kind of, I suppose, swipe at tradition. Because if we take the higher level, the intellectual elevation, that's about the literal, not the figurative, all of a sudden, that's not really about tradition. That's oftentimes breaking with tradition. So Maimonides, I think, begins to orient us that there's a challenge in tradition. It has some benefits, and we're quick to point those out, and oftentimes we take advantage of those, but it has some drawbacks if we're not going to open the discussion in a sort of deeper kind of way. And I think many people recognize this for a long time, and so we don't always talk about it directly, but many scholars have spent a lot of time thinking about how we unpack this tradition, this idea of tradition. And Gershom Shalom, who was a great scholar of mysticism, I never met him, but I heard all sorts of things about him. We had some of these kind of similar faculty that worked at Spertus. They left Europe in the 30s. They were really important scholars in the 40s and 50s. And Shalom fits into this kind of general type of scholar that I was familiar with from Spertus lore. And he's a very thoughtful guy, but he also has a very specific approach to philosophy and mysticism and all these things. But he writes the following, number 7. Tradition is not simply the totality of that which the community possesses as its cultural patrimony, right? So it's not simply everything that the community does and which it bequeaths to its posterity. It's not only those things, and it's not only the things that we pass on. So what is he saying? It's a specific selection from this patrimony, which is elevated and garbed with religious authority. I just savored this language, right? It's elevated. We take certain things in our tradition, in our behaviors, we pull them out very consciously, and then we elevate them and we put religious garb on them to suggest that these are the traditions that are the holy ones. But many of the other practices, like the common things that other people are doing, those fall by the wayside. We decide that they're no longer relevant, or maybe they're not good anymore. So he's suggesting something really powerful here, I think, which is that we are consciously all the time selecting from the things that we do, that we've done, that we inherit from other people, and we're elevating some, and we're elevating to the sort of status of religious, almost fundamentalism, right? The religious garb. And at the same time, we are purposely deselecting other kinds of behaviors. That's a really powerful statement. It proclaims certain things, he writes, sentences or insights to be Torah, and this connects them with the revelation. So every time we pull out one of these things from our tradition and we say, this is the true tradition, it's automatically default connected all the way back to the Torah, right? And so it can't be separated, it's not evolved, but it's our own self-selection in a certain way, but it automatically becomes connected in a very significant way to the past. Yeah. I think Gershom Shalom would suggest it's top-down, but doesn't have to be. Right? We've also learned that in many cases, what is common practice eventually trumps anything that the intellectual elite or the rabbis might have preferred. It depends on the community, but I think given his intellectual fervor and his interest in mysticism and these things, I would say it's probably the intellectual top-down. But there are different ways one could imagine that. But I think that the crucial observation is that tradition is curated. It's selected. It's not something that just exists out there. We actually shape it consciously, sometimes unconsciously as well. I think sometimes we just adopt things without having thought about them. But when you think about tradition in this way, it becomes a much more malleable but much more powerful kind of concept. Please. Yeah. Yeah, and different groups are selecting for different reasons. As I said, I'm a medievalist. I work on late medieval Germany. And it's a very interesting thing that if you look around Germany for certain traditions or customs about things as fundamental as whether certain wine is kosher, or certain milk is kosher, or certain bread is kosher, it depends entirely on the particular community and their traditions, but also the practical realities of their lives. Right? And so in many cases, we see these tensions being played out in very different ways, depending on where people might be living, where they might be coming from, what kinds of external conditions they might be facing, as well as internal politics. I mean, I've done some work before for the Orthodox Union, so I know about internal politics and kashrut. I will say that they paid me really well because all I had to do was sit there and watch them drain trucks full of oil and then clean them out and then watch them fill them again. I made a lot of money. As a graduate student, it's the best job you could have. Right, it's amazing. But that explains why our food costs so much money, probably. Yeah. Yeah, and notice though, but tradition in this case can be weaponized too. Because oftentimes we'll find someone that says, well, it's true, it's a different culture, a different sort of way of functioning, a different kind of customs, but those aren't legitimate. Right, and so we do use it as a way of creating boundaries within our communities and beyond also. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So every community has a different kind of, right? I mean, it does throw into question this whole discussion we had recently about peoplehood. Like, peoplehood is one of those things we love to talk about, but we don't really understand, and I don't really know that it makes a whole lot of sense, right? It's kind of a question of what is it that keeps people connected together if it's not only religion, and sometimes the religious aspects are the most divisive. My colleague Karen Freeman and I did an article a few years ago, and we basically argue that what makes peoplehood is diversity. And when you can recognize diversity within Judaism, then you've created peoplehood, because then people see their own narrative in a broader construct, right? It's no longer about a specific super narrative that everybody has to adhere to, but you find your voice and you find yourself in that broader narrative, and that creates a sense of connection. That's really hard to do, though, right? Really hard to do. No, and by the way, Israel also has its own questions about peoplehood and whether they're part of the Jewish people also. Yeah. Oh, wow, nice. Well, they were invited, so they did the right thing, I suppose. Yeah, I would have left also, so that's the kind of thing they might do in my neighborhood, so I'm okay with it. Which is why, did I mention they don't invite me to speak in my neighborhood? The funny thing is I was sharing with Mark that I taught for many years at Skokie Yeshiva, which is an Orthodox yeshiva, and it was great. I love the students, they love my teaching, but I could guarantee that the morning after I taught, I would get a call from the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of Yeshiva, would ask me, what were you teaching last night exactly, and do you really need to teach that? And I'm like, yeah, take it or leave it in this case, and I was the chair of the history department, so they took it. It was great. But so tradition does have this sort of political and communal dimensions that I think are really important. And if you think of some of the more modern, in this case sort of more orthodox thinkers as well, like Yitzchak Yaakov Reines, on number 8, it gives you a sort of dimension and a texture as well. He writes, by giving the Torah in this way, leaving room for doubts and disputes, it's one of my favorite lines, the Torah showed that the will of God, may he be blessed, was that everyone should endeavor to aim for the truth without assurance of actually finding it, because the quest for truth is beloved by the Holy One, blessed be he, and is dear as the truth itself. Truth is not naturally or intrinsically limited. No man could grasp it entirely, and his mission in the world is only to seek truth. It lines up really nicely with what I said last night about the imperfect leader, or the idea of imperfection. It's very rare, in fact, aside from myself, I don't know anybody that actually has found full truth. That was a joke. I didn't mean it. My kids probably think that I do think that, but they'd be wrong. But this idea of coming closer to truth, seeking out truth, the process of finding truth, whatever truth might be, is actually the thing that we're trying to do. And so when you think about tradition as that, right? Getting ever closer that we can to that kind of insight or inspiration, then it means something quite different. Okay. Now, the rabbis themselves oftentimes played fast and furious with traditions and with truths, which is one of the reasons I love reading rabbinic stuff. Mark and I had this conversation. I didn't say this to him, but the reason why I don't study the Bible or rabbinics is that I would for sure, I couldn't live with myself with the personal and the professional bifurcation. So I stay in the Middle Ages. It's like a little bit of everything. It's not so bad, and I don't have to worry about it. But I would have so many issues with the Bible and the rabbinic writings that I don't think it would work really well. But I love sitting on the sidelines and pontificating about it. It's much better this way. But there are some great rabbinic texts that actually do exactly these kinds of things. I just happened to be reading, there's a professor at Berkeley named Daniel Boyarin. I studied at Berkeley, but I studied German history, so I never took a course with him. And the students in graduate school, we all had our own house. It was the Orthodox Bayit. We never went to the Orthodox synagogue. There were like 2 separate Orthodox streams on campus. It was very strange. Boyarin was always with the faculty, not with the students. And he's published a lot of really important, really interesting books. Many of them seem to me impossible to decipher. I don't really know what the man is talking about. It sounds really good. He's really smart. Does a lot of postmodern thinking, a lot of literary criticism. He introduced the term intertextuality. It's just a good term. It sounds great. But what he means by that is the rabbis were great at taking texts and reassembling them. They would pick out biblical passages, they would put them into conversation with other biblical passages, and they would make new meaning out of it. And that's really pretty impressive. You have to know the text really well, and then you have to be able to have an idea of what it is you want to create out of it. But the rabbis are oftentimes doing these very strange things. And Boyarin has a book that came out probably about a decade ago or so, but I finally bought it. And I'll admit I only bought it because I liked the title. The title was called Socrates and the Fat Rabbis. I thought, well, this is pretty good. I mean, Socrates and the Fat Rabbis, it has to be good. It wasn't that good. But what he tries to do is show that the rabbis are using very similar literary techniques to Socrates and Plato. Right? It's centuries separated and it's geographically dispersed, but they have the same kind of basic literary approach. And so they tell wondrous stories, and they oftentimes tell stories about things that seem problematic, but there's a deeper lesson, and it's part of the rabbinic project, let's just say. So this text oftentimes feels like it fits into that category for me, as does the next one. So I want to spend a couple minutes on these 2 rabbinic texts, and then from there I want to introduce a few comparative ways of thinking about tradition maybe differently, and then conclude with some German philosophy, because what would a talk at a synagogue on Shabbat be without German philosophy, and try to make a few final conclusions. But don't worry, it's not Heidegger. I'm not bringing any Nazi philosophers, although I think he did study with Heidegger, so it's close. Okay, so in the Talmud, in Eruvin, they writes the following. Rabbah asked, "Does the master know of that tree?" Rav Yosef said to him, "No, I do not know of it." He said to him, "Then rely on me, as it was taught in a Braita that Rabbi Yosef says, if 2 people were walking together, one of whom is familiar with a particular location in the distance, and one is not familiar with it, the one who is not familiar with it entrusts his right to designate his residence to the one who is familiar with it, and the one who is familiar with it says, my residence is in such and such a place," right? 2 people walking, one doesn't seem to know, the other does, we rely on the person that knows. The Gemara comments, the Talmud responds, "But it is not so. That is not the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. Rabbah only taught it as if it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, so that Rav Yosef would accept it from him, due to the fact that Rabbi Yosef's reasoning accompanies his rulings, since the halakha is usually in accordance with Rav Yosef's opinion. Rav Yosef would be less likely to raise doubts with regard to the ruling." So he's giving a fake citation, basically. This guy didn't actually say any of that, but he's going to use his name because he knows that he always follows that guy's rulings. And if he said that, then it must be okay. So the rabbis are really playing with this sort of really interesting idea that sometimes we bring a tradition that's not really a tradition, right? We just made it up in this case, and we ascribed it to somebody else so that it's elevated with religious garb, like Shalom says, and now it has some sort of currency or some sort of persuasion. But what's fascinating is that they're admitting in the text that no, that wasn't really the case. He made it up. So when does tradition start and stop? When do we have like the actual footnotes? Does it even matter that there was a tradition that said it, right? The debate is about a particular halakhic issue in this case. So it's a complicated text, but the upshot of it, the punchline, is that traditions are sometimes made up and invoked for various reasons, sometimes, and in many cases, almost the opposite of what they might have implied in real life. So that's really sort of amazing. This next one is also, I think, kind of a curious text. And I'll share with you that I had written this in chapter 7 of the book that I just finished. And then one of the readers of the book said, oh, this is the most amazing book, but chapter 7 through 10 don't make a lot of sense. And I went back and decided to read them, and I have to say, they were right. It didn't make a lot of sense. And it's because I didn't really do a very good job with this text. So I took the text out. It's easier than trying to grapple with it. I just took it away. I had too many words already, it didn't matter. So this is in Brachot. Number 10. This may be derived from an incident involving two rabbinic scholars, Rabbah and Rav Yosef. As Rav Yosef was Sinai, this isn't very good for today. What does Sinai mean? Extremely erudite, right? We can imagine he got all the knowledge from Sinai. And Rabbah was one who uproots mountains. So just the opposite of getting the Torah from Sinai, this guy is uprooting the mountains and destroying things. Extremely sharp is the language that's used. The moment arrived when they were needed. One of them was to be chosen as head of the yeshiva. They sent the following question there to the sages all over the land of Israel. Which takes precedence, Sinai or one who uproots mountains? Right, the extremely erudite one or the very critical and sharp one? They sent to them in response, Sinai takes precedence, for everyone needs the owner of the wheat, one who is expert in the sources. Nevertheless, Rav Yosef did not accept the appointment. As the Chaldean astrologers told him, you will preside as head of the yeshiva for 2 years. So the guy who was the erudite expert, decided to not take the position, and he stood back based on a horoscope that said, well, you're only going to rule for 2 years. Rabbah, instead, this is the one who uproots mountains, presided as the head of the yeshiva for 22 years. Now imagine, you're going into this learning space, and you got the guy that is digging into everything. He's really sharp. He's casting things upside down. That's my kind of place. Right? You go in and sort of see what's really happening. After he died, Rav Yosef presided for 2.5 years, just like his horoscope said. Right? We knew this was going to happen. It's exactly what happens. What the Talmud tells us. Though he did not take advantage of the opportunity that presented itself, he ultimately fulfilled that for which he was destined. So it's only a short period of time, 2.5 years, composed of the 22 years of our mountainous uprooter, but he did exactly what he was supposed to do. It's an interesting lesson, right? Even when it's a small portion, tradition still is very powerful, and it can overcome and sometimes restore all the things that have been uprooted before. And I love this kind of parallel language in here, right? We had all this tumult before. We just need 2 years, 1/10 of the time in order to set things straight again, because he's introducing, in this case, something that is connected between erudition and tradition. Those two are directly connected. The Gemara relates that all those years that Rabbah presided, Rav Yosef did not even call a blood letter to his home. Rav Yosef did not assume even the slightest air of authority and would go to seek out the blood letter rather than call upon the blood letter to accommodate him. So even the person who is the bearer of tradition didn't have this sort of hubris of any kind, just sat back and waited for his time to come. There's an interesting lesson of the ebb and flow here, that we always return back to a tradition, right? Even through periods of tumult and through periods of criticism, whatever they might be. So we've come a long way in thinking about tradition. It serves a lot of purposes. It can be manipulated, but it's still valuable. It doesn't always mean it's a bad thing, even if it's being manipulated or if it's being used in certain kinds of ways. As Maimonides said, it's a necessary belief. It creates a sense of connection, of obedience. That's different maybe than the true beliefs, which are about elevating our intellect and thinking and digging a little bit deeper like Rabbah might have. And I've thought for a long time that in the Jewish world, we don't really grapple with this idea a lot. We tend to fall into the category of either tradition is a good thing or it's a bad thing. But there is something in between, I think, and Christian theology has actually shared quite a bit of this recently in the last decade or so. And I want to share just a few quotes from a really interesting study which deals with the idea of traditioning, tradition as a verb, as a gerund, as opposed to tradition as a noun. Because if you start to think about tradition as an active word rather than a substance, right, a noun, then it begins to take on very different kinds of qualities. So tradition is at times, this is number 11, tradition is at times portrayed as dynamic and changing locus theologicus, a sort of a position or a point of theology. And this is the quote. The unfolding of tradition as a natural process of causation emanating from the Holy Spirit that grounds the believer in the life of faith. That is, living tradition is inherently continuous with the original apostolic teaching because the word of the divine moving through all centuries cannot produce an outward expression that is inconsistent with its ultimate source and identity. Right? In this way, tradition is living It's organic. It's evolving from the original life source. We might think of that as Torah in our case, or God. In this case, it's Christ. It's evolving from that, but it's always connected and it's still moving forward. So there's something about it that is organic, that's evolutionary, that's sort of part of a process. Tradition is a process in this regard. She writes, this is Colleen Mallon in Traditioning Disciplines. She writes also, individuals within a tradition both receive tradition as a gift, right? It's something that we're given, that we're bequeathed from previous generations and people, and engage in the task of questioning, refuting, and contesting aspects of the tradition that are seemingly irrelevant, right? So we're given something as a tradition, but our responsibility isn't just to absorb it, our responsibility to say, what is this? And how do we know that? And what might be other ways to think about it, right? And so this refutation, this kind of, by the way, you'll see later when I get to my German philosopher, that's the thing that makes something living and powerful. Otherwise, tradition becomes kind of inert and dead. If it doesn't speak to us, if it has no reality for us, if we're just hearing from what we've heard before, so what? That's great. It was meaningful somewhere else, but what does it mean to me? I think oftentimes that's what we find in Jewish education today. We can tell people what to believe. We can scream at them. In my case, they used to throw chalk at us in the Hebrew school. Didn't work because I didn't pay attention then either, just threw the chalk back. But it doesn't make it part of my own being, right? It doesn't make it meaningful for me. So how are the ways that we make it meaningful? By engaging with it, asking questions of it. And oftentimes, Barry Holtz, who was at the seminary for many years in Jewish education, used to say, after a period of time, when you begin to allow people to engage, they actually engage with a lot of the tradition and they absorb a lot of it. But if you try to shove it down their throats, then they reject all of it. So where do we find the balance of how we engage with this? And finally, Mallon writes, the conserving character of tradition, because we tend to think of tradition as a very conservative thing, right? We want to prolong something, we want to hearken back to something from before, does not eliminate progress and growth, but novelty must be avoided by maintaining an organic continuity with the past. Understanding, knowledge, and wisdom grow, but always within the limits that conserve their essential character as a Christian faith. I suggested this last night as well. There are certain things that we think are essential and we don't want to give up, say in our Jewish practice or our Jewish belief. But there are many other things around that are open to interpretation, customs and traditions among those. So how do we decide what are the things that are central, that are essential, that we don't want to give up? And what are the things where we're open to having discussion and dialogue and debate? And so her argument is that there are elements that continue on even as we question them, even as we ask and refine and think differently as a result. The next two quotes I'm not going to go into, but I want to suggest that what we've learned over the last several years, this comes from a book by Mark Shapiro, who teaches at the University of Scranton. Has anybody ever been to Scranton? Yeah, don't go. I mean, it's famous for The Office, I think. Most of my wife's family lives in Scranton, and I'll just share this one story because if you're an academic, the wonderful thing about being an academic is that you get invited to apply for jobs. They invite you to the university campus where you give the job talk. So I remember the first university I was invited to out of graduate school was the University of Scranton, which I already didn't want to live in because my wife's family lives in Scranton. Like, why would I want to go back there? And if you go to Scranton, they do open mining in the middle of the streets. There's flames coming out of barrels. It's a terrible, horrendous place. But it's a job, right? It's a university. It's a Jesuit college. It's a good college. They have a yeshiva there. My chavruta in those days, his daughter was married to the Rosh Yeshiva. I had like yichus. I had connections. It was great. But I clearly didn't want the job. So I show up, have a great series of meetings during the day, and then at the end of the day, I'm giving the job talk to like students and faculty and administrators. It was the worst talk I've ever given in my life. No eye contact. No, I just read what I was going to do. And I wrote a really scathing paper in which I compared the city of Scranton to a medieval city unfavorably. I said so many bad things about Scranton in that talk. I still don't know why. The most amazing thing to me was not that I didn't get the job, which is I clearly was banking on, but that I finished second. So I couldn't imagine what the people in the third and fourth position said that was worse than what I said. But anyway, so Mark ended up getting the job. So I've known him for a number of years. He's a very fine scholar. He chose to live in New York, and he commutes to Scranton, so he's smarter than me also. And he has this wonderful book called Changing the Immutable, How Orthodox Judaism Rewrites Its History. And his basic point is that if you look at Orthodox writing in the course of the 19th and the 20th centuries, Orthodoxy always presented itself, particularly ultra-Orthodoxy, as tradition-based. And his argument is that actually this Orthodoxy was more revolutionary than even the Reform movement. They curated what they passed on. It's Gershom Sholom's notion of what we're selecting from the tradition. And they also recontextualized it and reframed it. And so they created a past that was in the image that they wanted for the future, but it wasn't actually the past. But you look at it and you think, well, that's the most sort of traditional part of our religion and our culture, but in fact, it's the most radical in a certain way. So it's a very good book. I recommend it. It's a bit dense, but there are chapters of it that are interesting, and I gave you a few quotes here just to suggest some of the important points that he makes about how we use tradition in different kinds of ways. In some ways, to make tradition, we use tradition, but sometimes we misuse tradition in making that tradition as well. So I want to conclude with, so this is great. You've talked a lot about tradition. You've talked about this idea that it can be used in many ways, and it's an active process, and it's not just a thing. So what do we do with this exactly? And there's a very famous German philosopher, Hans-Georg Gadamer, who wrote a book in 1960 called Truth and Method. And I don't know, I always put off reading this book. It's like 650 pages long. It's really dense German. I'm like not really sure I'm into this. But I decided to tackle it at some point, and I read it, and it's a really remarkable book in many ways. He gets criticized by lots of people for a variety of different things. He's also seen oftentimes as very conservative, even though he questions the idea of tradition. But he has a few insights that resonate with some of what I shared earlier, and I want to just circle back to those by way of conclusion. So number 16, Gadamer writes, but understanding it will always involve more than merely historical reconstructing the past world to which the work belongs. Our understanding will always retain the consciousness that we too belong to that world, and correlatively that the work too belongs to our world. So he makes this really fascinating point that we ourselves are connected to the past, but the text is also connected to us, the text from the past. So there's this strange symbiosis that holds all of these things together in an interwoven way. We're part of the past, but the text is part of us. So the text is dipping into the past, the tradition, but it's also moving along with us. So what happens? This process of construal is itself already governed by an expectation of meaning that follows from the context of what has gone before. His sense is that we make meaning out of a text or a tradition by the context in which it exists. That might have been in the past, or it might be today, right? But the text itself doesn't exist without the context. Text and context always go together, because the text can be read from a variety of different perspectives depending on the specific issues at hand. So this is his great Kiddush, this is his great idea at the end. Every age has to understand a transmitted text in its own way, for the text belongs to the whole tradition whose content interests the age and which it seeks to understand itself. The real meaning of a text as it speaks to the interpreter, right? The text, I love this language. The text speaks to the interpreter. We're the interpreter. We're always interpreting the things that we read and see. It does not depend on the contingencies of the author and its original audience. It doesn't matter when it was written or what was being conceived at the time. It certainly is not identical with them, for it is always co-determined also by the historical situation of the interpreter and hence by the totality of the objective course of history. So the interpreter is part of the tradition. It's not so radical to say that we can completely separate ourselves out from what came before. We ourselves are part of the tradition, right? We're part of that interpretive tradition. But we can't understand the text without taking into account the current context and the way that we engage with it. And that's the beautiful sort of insight that I think comes back to tradition, is we need traditions as a way of framing and guiding and giving us things to talk about. But we interpret and reinterpret and ask questions and interrogate and make meaning of these traditions in ways that are helpful for us and that in this organic process then move us forward in new traditions as well. So tradition is important, but it's an ever evolving process. And I think if we think about it in those regards, I suppose it makes sense that I'm in a conservative shul, not an Orthodox one at this point. But Orthodoxy does similar kinds of things as well, I think. Whether they acknowledge it or not, that's what we've always done, because tradition has to be meaningful only when it's meaningful to us in the moment and we can do something with it. Yes? Yeah. Yeah, and I think the medievals get a bad rap, right? Everybody thinks medievals didn't think very much, but actually there's a lot of biblical criticism going on in the Middle Ages already. not really in the way that we think about modern biblical criticism, but not so dissimilar in some ways. Ibn Ezra finds all sorts of problems with the text and elucidates upon them. So there's really interesting stuff in the medieval way. Yes. Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about that, assuming it's a true story, and it probably is in some cases, is that you can break with certain traditions, but there's others that we talked about, food and culture and other things that continued to persist. It's really interesting to study that kind of generation of migrants to see, well, what are the traditions that they kept and what are the ones that they sort of moved away from and which ones came back? Right, so we may actually throw some things out, literally in this case, throw them in the water, but we actually are still holding on to things, and in part, it's impossible to get rid of them entirely. The question is, how do we focus on those? How do we elevate them in a way that makes it possible for to engage in meaningful ways for the future? But that act is really an important one, but there's so much more going on in a certain way. Yeah.
Well, that's why the Parsha study is interesting, even though we read the same text over and over again, they're always different.
Yeah. No, I know. Every time I read something, I take away a different insight, which is why I read books over and over again. And one of the reasons I love poetry, because each time you read poetry, you can see a different perspective, you make new meaning out of it. Based on what you were thinking about earlier in the day, you might have a completely different reading. And so we are interpretive in a certain way, but that's part of our tradition, is ongoing, constant interpretation. Any final questions? Otherwise, I'll leave you with that to think about and turn tradition into a verb instead of a noun. All right, thank you very much.